Millionaire falls for a jilted bride, hiding in his mansion. She's escaping an arranged marriage. On a storm-soaked night over Lake Tahoe, a woman in a torn wedding gown appeared on a wealthy man's doorstep with 4 desperate words. "Please, I need to hide." But what started as a night of shelter would become something neither of them expected. He was a man who hadn't let anyone close in 7 years. She was a woman forced to choose between her family's empire and her own freedom. And in a secluded mansion on a mountainside, 2 broken hearts would learn what it truly means to be loved for who you are, not what you have. Because sometimes the person who saves you isn't someone you're looking for. They're someone who appears in the rain, and their presence changes the entire trajectory of your life. This is a story about what happens when 2 people who have been living in cages finally choose freedom and find each other in the process. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our heartwarming stories. His name was Julian Pierce, and he was living a life that looked perfect from the outside. At 42 years old, he had built a real estate empire that most people only dreamed about. His wealth was undeniable. His reputation was spotless. His net worth was in the hundreds of millions. Women wanted him. Men respected him. He was invited to the best events in San Francisco and Los Angeles. He had everything that money could buy. But there was one thing Julian didn't have, and it was the one thing that mattered most: a genuine human connection. He didn't have someone to share his success with. He didn't have anyone who loved him for who he was beneath the expensive suits and the business deals and the carefully constructed image. The truth was, Julian hadn't always been this way. 7 years ago, he was engaged to a woman named Catherine. She was a teacher, not rich, not powerful, but she had something Julian had been searching for his entire life. She had authenticity. She had kindness. She had a genuine interest in who he was as a person, not what he could do for her. Catherine saw Julian when no one else did. She saw past the armor, past the ambition, past all the walls he'd built around himself. She made him feel like he was enough, just as he was. They had planned their entire lives together. They'd picked out a house in Marin County. They'd talked about the kind of children they wanted to have. They'd dreamed about growing old together. Julian had experienced for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to be completely, vulnerably open with another human being. He'd learned what it meant to trust someone with your whole heart. And then, on a rainy evening in October, Catherine was driving home from work when a drunk driver ran a red light. Her car was hit head-on. She died at the hospital before Julian could even get there. That single moment changed everything. Julian had gone to Catherine's funeral and watched her casket being lowered into the ground, and something inside him had broken in a way that couldn't be repaired. The grief was so intense, so all-consuming, that for months he couldn't breathe without feeling like he was dying. He couldn't see her favorite color without falling apart. He couldn't hear her favorite song without needing to leave the room, and then one day the grief had calcified into something else. It had turned into anger, and then that anger had turned into a decision. Julian had decided with absolute certainty that he would never let anyone close enough to hurt him like that again. He made a vow to himself in the parking lot of his office building one morning. He would become impenetrable. He would build walls so high and so thick that no one could ever penetrate them. He would dedicate his life to his work, to his money, to things that couldn't leave him. Money was safe, property was safe, success was safe, people were not. So he built his walls. He built them carefully, methodically, the same way he built his buildings. He hired architects and engineers to design his new life. The architecture was flawless, not a crack in the foundation, not a single weak point. In public, Julian was charming. He could work a room like a master. He could make anyone feel special for exactly as long as it took to get what he wanted from them. He could close a deal worth millions by making the other person feel like they were the only one he cared about. But letting people in, actually letting someone past his defenses, that wasn't part of his plan anymore. He had stopped dating after Catherine. He had stopped attending social events unless they were business-related. He had stopped keeping friends around who might want to get close to him. He kept his circle small and professional. He had his assistant, who knew not to ask personal questions. He had his accountant, his lawyers, his business managers, all of them carefully hired based on their professional credentials and their ability to maintain distance. Julian spent his evenings alone in that mansion. The place was enormous, 12 bedrooms, each one decorated by a high-end interior designer and never actually used. There was a wine cellar with bottles worth thousands of dollars each, though Julian rarely drank wine. He preferred bourbon, neat, usually consumed alone by a fireplace, while staring out at views that would make most people weep with gratitude. He had a library with first editions of books he'd never read. He had a home gym he never went to. He had a pool table, a billiards room, a game room, all the amenities of a life being lived. But the only person in those rooms was him. Every detail in that mansion was perfect. Every corner was immaculate. The staff he hired to maintain the property were instructed to keep everything pristine and to maintain absolute silence about his private life. There were no photographs of family on the walls, no evidence of a life being lived, only a life being maintained. There were no messy human relationships. There were no disagreements or arguments, or the kind of unpredictable chaos that came with loving another person. The mansion was beautiful, the way a museum is beautiful, impressive, commanding attention, but fundamentally cold. It was a place to show off, not a place to live. That particular night, the storm had been rolling in since sunset. Lightning was tracing patterns across the dark water of Lake Tahoe. The wind was howling through the trees with an intensity that made the old mansion creak and shift. The rain wasn't just falling. It was attacking, pounding against the windows with such force that Julian could feel it from inside the house. Weather services had warned of potential flooding in some areas. It was the kind of night when most people wanted to be with family, or at least with someone. It was the kind of night when loneliness felt especially heavy. Julian had settled into his usual routine. He'd poured a glass of bourbon, not his first of the evening. He'd lit the fire in the main living room. He'd settled into his leather chair, the kind of chair that cost more than most people's cars, and he'd picked up a book he wasn't really reading. It was a novel that had been recommended to him by someone whose opinion he didn't actually value, but he'd bought it anyway because he had nothing but time and money. He was simply existing in that space, between sleep and wakefulness, where the outside world couldn't touch him, where nothing and no one could hurt him anymore. He expected the night to unfold exactly as 1,000 other nights had. He expected silence. He expected solitude. He expected nothing but the predictable rhythm of his own loneliness. He had no idea someone was driving toward him through the rain, completely desperate, completely broken, about to shatter his carefully constructed world into 1,000 pieces. Her name was Natalie Rivers. She was 28 years old. She was beautiful in the way that wealthy women often are, not because of any natural advantage, but because wealth buys access to the best of everything. The best dermatologists, the best trainers, the best nutritionists, the best stylists. Natalie had been groomed since childhood to represent her family well. She came from San Francisco's most powerful family. The Rivers name opened doors that normal people didn't even know existed. Her father, Richard Rivers, was the kind of man who could end careers with a single phone call. He was ruthless, brilliant, completely consumed by the idea of legacy, and he had absolutely no patience for anything he perceived as weakness. Natalie had grown up surrounded by wealth, but it was the kind of wealth that came with a suffocating price. The price was control. The price was obedience. The price was the complete erasure of your own wants and needs and dreams if they didn't align with what the family needed. From the moment Natalie was old enough to understand, she was told what her life would look like. She would go to the right schools, and she did, the very best ones. She would join the right clubs, attend the right social events, wear the right clothes. She would eventually marry the right man, someone who would enhance the family's power and reach. She would produce the right heirs. She would exist as a beautiful, compliant piece of her father's empire. She would smile when she was supposed to smile. She would say the right things. She would be the perfect representation of the Rivers family name. For most of her life, Natalie had tried to fit into that mold. She was a dutiful daughter. She was obedient and polite. She wore the clothes her mother picked out, though she secretly preferred simpler styles. She attended the events she was told to attend, though she would have preferred to spend time reading or painting or doing any of the things that made her feel alive. She smiled when she was supposed to smile, even when she felt like screaming. She played the role that had been written for her before she was even born. But inside, deep inside, buried beneath years of conditioning and expectation and fear, there was something else. There was a part of Natalie that wanted more, something that wanted to choose her own life, something that wanted to experience love, real love, not the transactional kind of love that came with a business proposal attached. Something that wanted to know who she was when she wasn't being watched and evaluated and compared to other women. That something had been small and quiet for a very long time, but it was still there. It was still beating. And eventually it would demand to be heard. That something finally broke free when her father announced her engagement to Charles Whitmore. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in her father's office. Richard Rivers had called Natalie in and told her as casually as one might discuss a business merger that he had arranged for her to marry Charles Whitmore. Charles was a 60-year-old investor with cold grey eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness that rivaled Richard Rivers himself. He had money, obscene amounts of money. He had power and influence that stretched across multiple continents. He had a vast network of connections that would benefit the Rivers family empire in ways that were difficult to even calculate. He had everything that mattered to Richard Rivers, but he did not have warmth. He did not have kindness. He did not have even a shred of genuine human feeling for Natalie. When he looked at her, he wasn't seeing a woman he wanted to love. He wasn't seeing a person with dreams and hopes and her own inner world. He was seeing an acquisition. He was seeing a prize that would come with a valuable alliance. Natalie was a commodity in this deal. Natalie had known this from the start, but she hadn't said anything. She'd been trained her entire life not to say anything, not to make a fuss, not to inconvenience anyone with her feelings or her opinions or her desire to actually be happy. Her mother had taught her this by example. Her mother, who was married to a man she didn't love, had learned decades ago that speaking up only led to punishment and isolation. So Natalie had nodded when her father told her about the engagement. She'd smiled. She'd pretended that this was exactly what she'd always wanted. She'd attended the engagement party in a dress worth $15,000 and smiled for the photographers and accepted congratulations from people she didn't even know. She attended the engagement party, where her engagement ring was displayed, a massive diamond flanked by smaller diamonds, a monument to wealth and status, but devoid of any meaning. She picked out the wedding dress with her mother, a creation that took 6 months to design and cost more than most houses. She let the invitations go out to 500 people, CEOs and politicians and celebrities and news anchors, all the people her father wanted to impress. She went through all the motions of planning a wedding, and with each motion she felt a little bit of herself dying. But 3 weeks before the wedding, as the reality of what was about to happen finally crashed down on her like a wave, Natalie did something she'd never done before. She went to her father's study and she told him the truth. She told him, with all the courage she could muster, that she couldn't marry Charles. She told him that the thought of spending her life with this man made her physically ill. She told him that whenever Charles touched her hand, her entire body rebelled against it. She told him that she wanted to choose her own path, to find her own love, to build her own life according to her own vision of what that life should be. And she asked him, begged him really, with tears streaming down her face, to call off the wedding. Her father had listened quietly to everything she said. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't raised his voice. When she finally finished speaking, he'd been silent for a very long time, and then he told her something she would never forget. He said, "Natalie, I didn't raise you to be selfish. Love is a luxury for people who don't have the responsibility we have. Our name carries weight. Our reputation means something. We have obligations to maintain. Love is a fairy tale for people without power or influence. What we have is duty. What we have is legacy. And legacy is far more important than any individual happiness. This marriage isn't about what you want. It's not about your feelings, it's about what the family needs. And what the family needs is this alliance with Charles Whitmore. You need to understand that your personal preferences don't enter into this equation. You are a Rivers, and Rivers women do their duty. We don't complain, we don't rebel, we fulfill our obligations. So you're going to put on that dress in 3 weeks. You're going to walk down that aisle. You're going to say yes when the priest asks the question. And you're going to smile while the photographers capture it all. Because that's what Rivers women do. Natalie had left his study with those words burning inside her. She'd gone to her mother's bedroom and told her everything, begging her to intervene, begging her to help her escape this situation. Her mother had simply looked sad and said nothing. She'd patted Natalie's hand but offered no support, no defense, nothing but silent acceptance of the way things had always been. She'd tried to talk to her brother, who was 5 years older and had his own life and his own concerns. He'd told her that it was her duty as a woman, that she needed to grow up and understand that this was the way the world worked. He'd said she was being dramatic. He'd said she would learn to love Charles in time. She'd tried to talk to her friends. They'd told her to make the best of it. They'd told her that marriage was about compromise. They'd told her she was lucky to be marrying a man with so much money and status. Everyone in her life, every single person she could think of, had reinforced the same message. This wasn't her choice to make. Her body wasn't hers to control. Her future wasn't hers to decide. She belonged to her family, and her family had decided what would happen to her. But Natalie had made a different choice. It wasn't a choice she announced, it wasn't a choice she planned, but it was a choice nonetheless, and it came to her in the moment when it mattered most. She'd made it standing at the altar 3 weeks later, wearing a dress that cost more than most people made in a year, wearing a veil that had been imported from Italy, wearing heels that were custom-made, looking into Charles Whitmore's cold, expectant eyes across a massive church filled with 500 of the most important people in San Francisco society. The priest had asked the question that had been asked thousands of times before, "Do you take this man to be your husband?" And in that moment, with all eyes on her, with all cameras pointed at her, with her father sitting in the front pew, watching her like a hawk, Natalie realized something fundamental. She couldn't do it. She couldn't spend the next 50 years of her life as a beautiful decoration in someone else's world. She couldn't disappear completely into this role. She couldn't give up every dream she'd ever had. She couldn't agree to spend her body and her time with a man who looked at her with complete indifference. Not today, not ever, not anymore. So instead of saying yes, she said nothing. She looked at the priest, she looked at Charles, she looked at her father, and then she turned and she ran. She ran down the aisle past the shocked faces of 500 guests who couldn't believe what they were seeing. She ran past her father, whose face had turned a shade of red she'd never seen before, the color of absolute rage and humiliation. She ran past her mother, who buried her face in her hands. She ran past Charles, who stood frozen at the altar, unable to believe that someone would actually reject him. She ran out of the church and into the parking lot and into her car, leaving behind a trail of devastation and scandal that would follow her for months. And then she drove. The drive had been a blur of rain and darkness and adrenaline. Her hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Her phone had started buzzing almost immediately after she left the church. Calls from her father. It took a long moment. Then she heard footsteps inside. Then the door opened and she saw him, a tall man with dark eyes and an expression of confusion quickly turning to concern. He was wearing an expensive shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he had a glass of bourbon in his hand. He looked like he'd been alone with his thoughts, and now those thoughts were being interrupted by a wet, muddy, desperate woman in a torn wedding dress. "I'm sorry," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what to do. My car broke down. My phone has no signal. I need help. I'm desperate. She looked up at him, and her eyes were filled with terror and desperation, and something else. A raw honesty that cut through all of Julian's carefully constructed walls in an instant. This wasn't a con artist. This wasn't someone trying to manipulate him. This was a human being in genuine distress. "Please," she whispered, "I need to hide." Julian's first instinct was to say no. His first instinct was to close the door and go back to his bourbon and his solitude. This was trouble. This was complication. This was exactly the kind of thing he'd spent 7 years avoiding: human connection, vulnerability, the possibility of being hurt or disappointed or let down. He'd built his walls to keep moments like this away from him. He'd constructed his entire life to avoid having to deal with other people's problems. But then he saw her more clearly. He saw that she was genuinely terrified. He saw that she was wearing what was left of a wedding dress. The once pristine white fabric was now torn, muddy, stained with water and rain and the evidence of her escape. He saw that she was shaking, whether from cold or fear or shock or all three combined, he couldn't tell. He saw that she was a woman who had clearly just made the biggest decision of her life, and she was now living with the immediate consequences of that decision. And something in him, something he'd thought was long dead, responded to that. Something in him recognized the courage it took to run from everything you knew. Something in him understood what it meant to choose yourself, even when that choice came at an impossible cost. "Come inside," he said quietly, stepping back from the door. "You're going to catch pneumonia standing out there." She didn't need to be told twice. She rushed past him, dripping water on his expensive floor, leaving muddy footprints on his pristine carpet. In that moment, as Julian watched her move through his house, leaving a trail of devastation behind her, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to let her stay. He was going to help her. He was going to break his own rules, violate his own boundaries, and open his house to another human being. He had no idea how much that decision would end up changing him. For the first night, they barely spoke. Julian had given her one of his guest bathrooms, a massive marble space with a rainfall shower and heated towel racks and every possible luxury. He'd left some clothes outside the door, a sweater and some sweatpants and socks, items that belonged to his late sister, Catherine. These were things he hadn't been able to throw away, but he also hadn't been able to look at in 7 years. Somehow, giving them to a stranger felt less painful than keeping them locked away. When Natalie emerged from the bathroom, she looked smaller somehow. Less like a runaway bride and more like a frightened young woman. Her dark hair was still wet and curling around her face. Her eyes were red from crying. She was wearing the sweater and sweatpants, which were too big on her, and she looked young and vulnerable and completely lost. Julian had made tea and set out some food: soup, fresh bread, fruit. He knew how shock affected the body. He knew that she probably wasn't thinking clearly. He knew that what she needed right now was warmth and safety and the knowledge that she wasn't going to be judged for her choices. Natalie had mostly just wrapped herself in one of the blankets he'd left on the couch and stared into the fire. The flames were mesmerizing. The warmth was comforting. For the first time in hours, she'd started to feel like she might actually survive this. "Do you want to talk about it?" Julian had asked. She'd looked at him for a long moment. Then she'd shaken her head. "I just need to not think about it," she said quietly. "Just for tonight. Just to not think." Julian had understood that completely. He'd spent 7 years not thinking about things that hurt. He'd spent years running from his own pain by burying himself in work and bourbon and the pursuit of things that couldn't leave him. So he'd simply nodded and sat beside her. They'd sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, neither of them feeling like they needed to say anything more. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was actually quite comfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood suffering, who recognized it in each other, and who didn't need to explain it. By midnight, exhaustion had claimed her. Her eyes had started to close, her head had begun to nod forward. Julian had gently guided her to the guest bedroom down the hall, showing her where the light switches were, making sure she had everything she needed. She'd fallen asleep almost instantly, still wearing the sweater and sweatpants, curled up under the soft sheets, like she'd finally found a safe place. Julian had stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep, and he'd felt something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't romantic attraction, though there was certainly something there, some recognition of her beauty. It was something deeper. It was empathy. It was the memory of what it felt like to be broken. It was the knowledge that he was looking at another human being who understood loneliness, who understood the pressure of expectations, who understood what it meant to have everyone trying to control your life. The next morning, Julian expected her to be gone. He expected to wake up and find that she'd left while he was sleeping, disappearing as mysteriously as she'd arrived, leaving only muddy footprints and a torn wedding dress as evidence that she'd ever been there. He expected that once she'd recovered from the shock and the exhaustion, she would have realized that staying with a stranger was a bad idea. But when he came downstairs, he heard sounds coming from the kitchen. When he pushed open the door, he found her standing in front of the stove, wearing his sister's sweater, trying to make pancakes. She was concentrating hard, reading from a recipe on her phone, and she'd managed to burn at least one batch already. The kitchen smelled like butter and slightly charred flour. She looked up when she saw him, and she gave him an apologetic smile. "I thought you might be hungry," she said. "But I have to warn you, I'm really not very good at cooking. I grew up with chefs. My father thought it was a waste of time for me to learn. He said my skills should be in things that mattered: business, politics, understanding how to navigate high society. But cooking, that was beneath us." For the first time in 7 years, Julian felt something crack open inside his chest. It wasn't romantic love, not yet. It was something simpler and more profound. It was recognition. It was the feeling of seeing another human being who understood what it meant to live in a cage built by other people's expectations. It was the recognition of a kindred spirit, someone who had also spent their life being told what to do and who to be and what to want. "Pancakes sound perfect," he said, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. Those first few days turned into a routine. Natalie would wake up and try to make breakfast, which was usually a disaster but always earnest. She'd come close to burning down the kitchen at one point trying to make scrambled eggs, but there was something charming about her willingness to try, despite her complete lack of skills. They'd sit and eat together, not talking much, just existing in the same space. Sometimes they'd share details about themselves, but mostly they just sat in comfortable silence. Julian would go to his home office to do work. He had calls with real estate agents in San Francisco and Los Angeles. He had deals that required his attention. He had numbers to review and contracts to analyze. But he found himself cutting these calls shorter and shorter. He found himself making excuses to get off the phone so he could get back to wherever Natalie was. It was a strange feeling. It was a feeling he'd thought was impossible for him. It was a feeling he'd deliberately trained himself not to have. Natalie, for her part, was slowly beginning to relax. The fear that had driven her to Julian's door was fading, replaced by something more like relief mixed with uncertainty. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if she could ever go back to her family. She didn't know what her father was planning or what legal actions might be coming her way. She didn't know if Charles was going to pursue any kind of lawsuit for breach of contract or any of the other threats his lawyers had been making. She didn't know what the outside world was saying about her. She'd deliberately kept herself isolated from the news, from social media, from anything that might pull her back into the chaos she'd escaped. She'd turned off her phone after the first night. She hadn't checked email or Twitter or Instagram or any of the platforms that were probably obsessed with her story right now. She'd made a conscious decision to live in this bubble, in this mansion by the lake, with this man who'd opened his door to her without asking for anything in return. On the third day, she finally told Julian her full story. She told him about the arranged marriage and her father's absolute refusal to listen to her objections. She told him about growing up under the weight of expectations and control. She told him about the moment at the altar when she'd realized she couldn't do it anymore. She cried, but it was a different kind of crying than it had been that first night. It was the crying of someone who was finally being honest about their pain, finally speaking truths they'd been holding inside for so long. And Julian, listening to her, found himself doing something he'd sworn he would never do again. He was opening up. He was telling her his story. He told her about Catherine, about their plans, about the accident, about the 7 years of isolation he'd been living in since her death. He told her about the walls he'd built and why he'd built them, and how those walls had ended up being the loneliest thing in the world. He told her things he'd never told another living soul. He told her about the guilt that he'd survived when Catherine hadn't, the guilt that he'd moved on and built a successful life while she was gone, the guilt that sometimes, in the quiet moments, he could barely remember what her voice sounded like, and somehow in that telling those walls began to crumble. Not all at once, they were too strong for that. But piece by piece, memory by memory, truth by truth, Julian began to dismantle the architecture of his loneliness. By the end of the first week, they were talking constantly. Natalie would follow Julian around the mansion while he worked. She'd ask him questions about everything: his business, his past, his favorite books, his thoughts on life, his opinions on everything from politics to art to the best way to make coffee. Julian, who'd spent so long keeping people at a distance, found that he couldn't stop talking to her. She had this way of listening that made him feel like what he was saying actually mattered. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She didn't try to fix him or change him or mold him into what she wanted him to be. She simply received him, completely and authentically. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire and talk for hours. Julian would tell her stories about building his first property, a small apartment complex in Oakland that he'd scraped together money for when he was just starting out. He'd tell her about the deals that had gone wrong, about the investors who'd screwed him over, about the fear he'd felt when he was starting out with nothing but ambition and no connections. He'd tell her about how he'd learned to be ruthless in business, and how that ruthlessness had eventually extended into his personal life, destroying his capacity for genuine connection. Natalie would tell him about her childhood, about the pressure of growing up in a powerful family, about the dreams she'd hidden away because they didn't align with what she was supposed to want. She told him that she'd wanted to be an artist, that she loved painting and drawing and the way creative expression made her feel alive. But her father had told her that art was frivolous, that it didn't matter, that she needed to focus on things that would benefit the family. So she'd put away her supplies and stopped painting, and for years she'd felt like a part of herself had died. "What do you want?" Julian asked her one night. "Not what your family wants, not what the world expects. What do you actually want?" Natalie was quiet for a long time. She stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. "I don't know," she finally said. "I've spent so long trying to be what everyone else wanted that I don't even know who I am outside of that." "Does that make sense? I'm 28 years old and I don't have any idea what I actually want. I know it sounds pathetic." "It doesn't sound pathetic," Julian said. "It sounds honest, and honesty is the first step toward figuring out who you are." He reached over and squeezed her hand just for a moment. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It meant that he saw her. It meant that he accepted her. It meant that her uncertainty and her confusion and her lack of direction didn't make her any less worthy of love. By the second week, the initial shock had worn off, and they were beginning to understand what was happening between them. There was chemistry there, undeniable and powerful. When they passed each other in the hallway, there was electricity in the air. When their hands touched while reaching for the same glass, it felt like something shifted in the universe. But more than that chemistry, there was recognition. They recognized in each other the pain of a life unlived. They recognized the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who didn't really see you. They recognized the courage it had taken for the other person to finally choose themselves, even when that choice came at an impossible cost. One evening, they were sitting on the terrace overlooking the lake. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and pink. The water was calm, reflecting the colors back toward them. It was one of those moments that felt almost too perfect, too beautiful, like it couldn't possibly be real. Natalie was curled up in a blanket, and Julian was beside her, close but not touching. "Can I ask you something?" Natalie said. "Anything," Julian replied. "Why did you build all of this?" she asked, gesturing to the mansion, the grounds, the view. "Why did you need so much? I mean, I understand needing enough. I understand wanting security and comfort. But this," she gestured again, "this is beyond comfort. This is a statement. This is someone saying to the world, I'm powerful, I'm successful, I'm untouchable. Why did you need to say that?" Julian thought about this for a long moment. He watched the sun continue its descent toward the horizon. He thought about the 7 years he'd spent in this mansion, alone, successful, miserable. He thought about how he'd believed that if he just had enough money, enough success, Enough things that couldn't be taken away from him, then he would be safe from pain. He thought about how that belief had been both his salvation and his prison. "I think," he said slowly, "I was trying to build something that could never be taken away from me. Money doesn't leave you. Property doesn't abandon you. Success doesn't betray you. A mansion doesn't break your heart. When Catherine died, everything I thought I knew about the world changed. I learned that people you love can be taken from you instantly, without warning, without giving you a chance to say goodbye. So I decided that I would never let that happen again. I decided that I would build a life based on things that couldn't leave me, things that couldn't hurt me, things that couldn't die." "But people can't hurt you if you don't let them close," Natalie said softly. "That's what you learned, right? That the best way to avoid pain is to avoid connection." "Yes," Julian said. "That's what I learned, or thought I learned." "And do you still believe that?" Natalie asked. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes, a question, a hope, a possibility. Julian looked at her, really looked at her, and he realized that his answer had changed. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I do anymore." He reached over and took her hand, and this time it wasn't a brief squeeze. This time he held it. He held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. He held it like he was afraid to let go. And she didn't pull away. She simply held his hand back, and in that moment something shifted between them. Something fundamental changed. The walls that Julian had spent 7 years building didn't crumble all at once, but they began to crack, and in those cracks, light started to come through. They kissed that night for the first time. It happened naturally, without planning, without discussion. They were still sitting on the terrace, still holding hands, still watching the last light fade from the sky. And then Julian leaned over and kissed her gently, tenderly, like he was asking permission. And she kissed him back. And for both of them, it felt like coming home. It felt like finding something they'd been searching for their entire lives. It felt like hope. But their bubble of peace couldn't last forever. In the outside world, things were moving quickly. The story of Natalie's runaway wedding had become huge. Every major news outlet was covering it. The story was evolving, becoming more scandalous with each passing day. The headline was everywhere. "Tech heiress abandons wedding at altar. Where is Natalie Rivers?" Her father had gone public with a massive reward for information about her location. The amount was staggering, $50,000 to anyone who could tell him where his daughter was. Charles Whitmore's lawyers were threatening legal action for breach of contract and emotional distress. The scandal was consuming social media, spawning memes and hot takes from everyone with an opinion. And then, on the morning of the 15th day, everything came crashing down. Julian was in his office when his assistant called. She sounded panicked, almost hysterical. "There are reporters outside the gates," she said, speaking quickly. "Dozens of them, maybe more. They're asking questions about whether you've seen Natalie Rivers. They're asking if she's at your property. How do they know to come here? How did they figure it out?" Julian felt his stomach drop. He'd thought they had more time. He'd thought they could stay in this bubble a little bit longer. He'd thought he could figure out how to handle the situation before it became a situation. But he'd been naive. Of course, reporters would figure it out. Of course, people would be digging into Julian's life, his connections, his properties. Of course, someone would eventually draw the line between the lonely millionaire and the missing bride. He ended the call and immediately went to find Natalie. She was in the library, reading, and she looked up when she saw his face. In that instant, she knew. She knew something had changed. She knew the world was crashing in on them. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "We have to talk," he said. They talked in the study with the doors closed and locked. Julian explained that the media had somehow found out that Natalie had been seen in the Lake Tahoe area. News outlets were connecting dots. Some journalist had done the work of figuring out which wealthy properties were in the area, and Julian's mansion had apparently made the list. It was only a matter of time before someone put two and two together. It was only a matter of time before reporters showed up, and when they did, the story would explode. Natalie listened quietly, and then she said the words Julian had been dreading to hear. "I should leave," she said. "I can't involve you in this. You've already risked so much just by letting me stay. I can't be the reason your reputation gets destroyed. You've worked too hard. You've built too much." "You're not involving me," Julian said immediately, his voice firm. "I made that choice the moment I opened the door. I made the choice to help you. I made the choice to let you stay. I made the choice to fall in love with you." "But your reputation," Natalie said, "your business. If it comes out that you've been hiding me, that you've known where I am this whole time, that you've been harboring a fugitive bride—" "I don't care," Julian said, and he meant it with an intensity that surprised them both. "Natalie, I don't care about any of that. I don't care if every investor I've ever worked with turns against me. I don't care if my business crumbles. I don't care if the media tears me apart. I care about you. That's all that matters to me. You matter to me." That's when Julian made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He walked to where she was sitting, and he knelt down in front of her. He took both her hands in his. "My life was already falling apart," he said. "I was just too scared to notice. Every day I spent alone in this mansion, every evening with my bourbon, every deal I closed, I was building an empire with no one to share it with. That's not a life, Natalie. That's a prison. And you set me free. So I'm asking you, stay. Not because you're hiding, not because you have nowhere else to go. Stay because we're choosing each other. Stay because in 2 weeks you've become the most important person in my life. Stay because I love you. Stay because I can't imagine my life without you in it." "Julian," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of a contract or an agreement or because our families want it. Marry me because you want to. Marry me because you love me. Marry me because you choose me." She looked down at him, kneeling in front of her. This powerful man who'd built an empire and isolated himself from the world, now offering her his completely vulnerable heart. And she realized that she did love him. She loved him with an intensity that frightened her. She loved him because he saw her. She loved him because he accepted her. She loved him because he made her feel like her choices mattered. She loved him because, together, they'd both found their way out of the cages they'd been living in. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to everything." They kissed, and it felt like making a vow. It felt like committing to something bigger than both of them. It felt like choosing love over safety, choosing each other over the rest of the world. But even love couldn't stop the outside world from crashing in. The next morning, the reporters had managed to get photographs. Julian and Natalie, together on the terrace, embracing, kissing, clearly in love. The headlines exploded immediately. Found, Natalie Rivers located at Lake Tahoe mansion. Runaway bride now shacked up with mystery millionaire. Tech heiress in secret romance with billionaire while family hunts her down. The truth behind the millionaire's mansion. Social media erupted. Some people were sympathetic to Natalie's cause. She was a woman who'd escaped an arranged marriage, who'd chosen her own path. Others were harsh, calling her ungrateful, calling her a scandal, calling her a disgrace to her family. Some were focused on Julian. Some thought he was romantic. Others thought he was a predator, taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. And then that afternoon, Charles Whitmore showed up at the gate. He was flanked by lawyers, expensive lawyers, the kind that specialized in high-stakes situations. He was furious. He'd been humiliated, he said. He'd been embarrassed publicly. Natalie had made a fool of him in front of everyone who mattered. His business associates had questions. His reputation had been damaged, and he was going to make sure she paid for that. "She contracted to marry me," he said to Julian, his voice icy. "Whether she likes it or not, she's my responsibility now, and you've been harboring her like she's your personal prize. You've been playing hero, but the truth is you're just another man trying to control her life. The only difference is that you're doing it with money instead of family pressure." Julian felt something shift inside him. For years, he'd allowed other people to dictate his emotions, to make him reactive, to control him through fear. He'd allowed his fear of pain to control his entire life. But in that moment, looking at Charles's face, listening to him speak about Natalie like she was a possession, Julian made a final choice. He was going to stand for her. He was going to fight for her. He was going to risk everything for her. "She's not your responsibility," Julian said, his voice calm but absolute. "She never was. She ran because she's not yours to control. She ran because she's not a piece of property to be owned or traded or used to further business alliances. She ran because she's a human being with her own agency, her own dreams, her own right to choose her own life. She's choosing to be here with me. So I think you need to leave." "Or what?" Charles asked, smirking. "What are you going to do, Pierce? You're a real estate mogul, not a fighter. You're all money and no substance." Julian picked up his phone and called a lawyer he knew, one of the best litigation attorneys in California. Within an hour, Charles Whitmore was informed that if he didn't leave the property immediately, he would be sued for harassment, trespassing, and attempted coercion. Charles left, but not before shouting threats about destroying Julian's business and ruining Natalie's life. That evening, the story went viral. Billionaire defends runaway bride against angry ex-fiancé. Millionaire puts his business on the line for love, the real love story behind the scandal. The narrative had shifted. Instead of Natalie being a scandal, she was being seen as brave. Instead of Julian being the villain, he was being seen as a romantic hero. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his entire life trying to control his image, and now that image was being shaped by forces completely outside his control. But he didn't care about the narrative anymore. What he cared about was Natalie. Over the next week, things continued to shift. Her father hired his own lawyers. There were negotiations. Natalie was an adult after all, she couldn't be forced into anything, but her father threatened to cut her off completely. He said if she didn't end this relationship, didn't come back to her family, she would no longer be considered a Rivers. She would be cut off financially. She would lose her trust fund, millions of dollars that had been set aside for her since childhood. She would be erased from the family. It was an ultimatum designed to break her, designed to force her back into the cage, designed to remind her that families had the power to destroy you if you didn't comply. But Natalie didn't break. She sat across from her father via video call, with Julian sitting beside her holding her hand, and she told him the truth. She told him that she loved him, but she wouldn't live her life according to his demands anymore. She told him that she was building her own future, making her own choices, becoming her own person. She told him that she was marrying Julian, not because she was running away from her father, but because she was running toward her own happiness. She told him that she hoped one day he could accept that. She told him that she hoped one day he could understand that true love meant wanting your child to be happy, even if that happiness looked different from what you'd imagined. She told him that whether he accepted it or not, whether he cut her off or not, whether he supported her or not, she was making this choice. She was choosing Julian. She was choosing love. She was choosing herself. Her father didn't respond for a long moment. Then he simply ended the call. That night, Natalie cried in Julian's arms. She mourned the relationship she'd lost, even though she knew she'd made the right choice. She grieved the loss of her family's financial support, but she also felt a strange sense of liberation. She was no longer dependent on them. She was no longer beholden to their expectations. She was free. And that freedom, despite its costs, was worth it. And Julian held her and told her that she was brave, that she was strong, that she was worth so much more than any amount of family wealth, that she was worth more than she could possibly imagine. Slowly, over the following months, things began to normalize. The media moved on to the next scandal, the next story, the next celebrity breakdown. Natalie's face stopped appearing on the news. The hashtag stopped trending. The world's attention moved elsewhere. And in that peace, in that quiet, Natalie and Julian began to build their real life together. Natalie's father, over time, began to soften. He started taking her calls. Eventually, he started visiting the mansion. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Richard Rivers was still Richard Rivers, still domineering and controlling in his own way. But it was a beginning. He started to understand that cutting off his daughter completely had consequences. He started to understand that his control had limits. He started to respect Natalie for her courage, Julian, meanwhile, had made some significant changes to his life. He scaled back his real estate empire significantly. He hired people he trusted to manage most of it. He sold some properties. He stepped away from the constant deal-making and the endless pursuit of more. He spent more time at the mansion by the lake. He learned how to enjoy his success instead of constantly chasing it. And more importantly, he opened his heart. He opened his home. He opened his life to another person. Something he'd thought was impossible after Catherine died. He went through his closet and finally boxed up Catherine's things. It was hard. It was painful. But it was also necessary. He was grieving, but he was doing it in a healthy way. He was honoring her memory while also allowing himself to move forward. And Natalie was there with him through all of it, supporting him, understanding him, loving him. 6 months after Natalie arrived at his door in her torn wedding dress, Julian took her back to that same mansion on a night when the weather was perfect. The lake was calm. The stars were out above them. The fire was burning in the fireplace. And he asked her to marry him, not with an ultimatum or a contract or a merger agreement, but simply with a question and an offering of his heart. "Natalie Rivers," he said, kneeling in front of her, a simple diamond ring in his hand, "I know we've only known each other for 6 months. I know that by conventional standards this is fast, but I also know that I've been waiting 7 years for you without even knowing it. I know that you're the person I want to build a life with. I know that you make me want to be a better man. I know that I love you completely and entirely. So I'm asking you, will you marry me?" She said yes. The wedding, when it came 6 months later, was intimate. Only close friends and family. No 500-person guest list. No business alliances being forged. No media circus. Just 2 people who had both been broken and had found healing in each other, committing to build a life together. A real life. A chosen life. Natalie wore a simple white dress, not the elaborate creation she'd fled from, but something beautiful and understated that actually reflected who she was. Julian wore a classic black suit. They exchanged vows that they'd written themselves, vows that spoke about choosing each other, about seeing each other, about building a life based on love and honesty and mutual respect. Natalie had taken Julian's name. She was now Natalie Pierce. She'd also taken a job working with a non-profit that helped women escape forced marriages and arranged situations. She was using her voice, using her platform, her story, to help others find the freedom she'd found. She was turning her pain into purpose, and Julian supported her completely. He donated to the non-profit. He attended fundraisers. He used his business connections to help raise awareness about the issue of forced marriages. Years later, when people asked them how they met, they would smile and tell the story in different ways depending on their audience. Sometimes Natalie would say that she'd literally run into the man of her dreams. Sometimes Julian would say that the best things in life come to you when you're not looking for them. Sometimes they'd laugh and say it was the worst first date ever, but the real answer was always simpler than that. They had each been living a lie. They had each been trapped in a world that wasn't theirs. They had each been slowly dying on the inside while maintaining a perfect image on the outside. And they had been brave enough to break free. Natalie had been brave enough to run. Julian had been brave enough to let someone in. And in that combination of bravery, love had found them. The mansion by Lake Tahoe, which had once been a monument to loneliness, became a home. It became filled with laughter and warmth and the sound of 2 people who had finally found where they belonged. It became filled with the sound of love. The fire in the fireplace burned warmer. The rooms that had been cold and empty filled with life and light. The walls that Julian had built so carefully, designed to keep pain out, came down completely, and in their place was something stronger. It was trust, it was vulnerability, it was the courage to love completely. Years passed. Natalie and Julian grew old together in that mansion by the lake. They had 2 children, both of whom learned from their parents the importance of choosing your own path, of honoring your own truth, of building a life based on love and authenticity rather than expectations and obligations. If you've watched this far, I know your heart is touched right now. And I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to choose between what your family wanted and what you needed? Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life? Or have you been like Julian, so afraid of being hurt that you built walls around your heart? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to hear your story, because I believe that everyone has a story, and every story matters. And if this story reminded you that true love isn't about perfection or possession, that it's about being completely, authentically seen by another person, then please like this video. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that touches your soul. And hit that notification bell so you're always the first to know when we post. Because life is too short to live it for anyone but yourself. And love, real love, is what we find when we're brave enough to choose ourselves first. It's what we find when we're willing to be vulnerable. It's what we find when we stop running from our own truth and start running toward our own happiness. Thank you for watching. Thank you for letting this story into your heart. Thank you for caring about Natalie and Julian's journey. We'll see you next time with another story that will touch your soul and remind you of what matters most in life. Take care of yourselves. Be brave. Choose yourself. And always, always, choose love.